Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're the show that helps you get that really deep, comprehensive grasp on complex strategic stuff without you having to sift through mountains of reading material yourself. Think of it as your shortcut to being genuinely well-informed.
Yeah, and today we're really tackling a big one. We're looking at the whole architecture, you could say, of United States national security.
Oh,
Pretty much, starting right from the political and cultural roots, and then tracing that logic all the way through the strategic guidance down into, how military operations actually work.
and the ethics, too.
Yeah, and definitely looking at the ethical constraints that kind of frame the whole thing.
Okay, so our mission today is pretty clear then. We want to unpack the key documents, the core ideas from the sources you've gathered, and really link those American values we talk about to the machinery of strategy and how the military executes it.
Exactly. We want to see where it all lines up nicely, but also, maybe more importantly, where things, inevitably clash or create tension.
Sounds good. Where do we start?
Well, let's go right back to the beginning. The absolute genesis of American political culture. Marybeth P. Ulrich, writing in the U.S. Army War College Guide to National Security Issues, she makes the case that the American Revolution is, arguably the single most important event in U.S. history.
Okay, that makes sense. It legally created the country.
Right. Legally created the United States. And it infused the culture with these really deep beliefs in liberty, equality, constitutionalism, the things we still talk about constantly.
But there's a twist, isn't there? Something a bit surprising in the readings about why they revolted.
Yes, and this is where it gets strategically interesting right away. The revolutionaries, and particularly scholars like Gordon Wood point this out, they argue they didn't revolt to create brand new freedoms.
They revolted to keep the ones they thought they already had.
Precisely, to maintain the freedom they believed they already possessed. It suggests the revolution wasn't this, radical break to make something totally new.
It was more like confirming what was already there.
Kind of a realization, you could say, of an American society that had already sort of naturally grown different from Europe over the previous century or so. They felt they were already equal, maybe a bit rustic, definitely free, and they wanted to preserve that.
Okay, and that right there, that's a huge signal for understanding American strategic culture, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's rooted in this desire to protect what you have, to resist anything that looks like oppression from especially a central power.
Which explains that deep, persistent skepticism about centralized government power that you see throughout American history. It starts right there.
It absolutely does. And that skepticism leads us straight into their first attempt at a government, the Articles of Confederation.
Ah, yes, the Articles. When you look at them, you really see that fear of central power written down, don't you?
It's like institutionalized skepticism. It was almost an exercise in making the government intentionally weak.
Because they had this visceral fear, right? Fear of a national government that could tax them, fear of a strong executive leader, a real aversion to standing armies.
All the things they associated with the British rule, they'd just overthrown. Richard H. Cohn points out, this first constitution deliberately created a very loose confederation. The states were largely independent.
And the entire national government was just Congress.
Just Congress.
Yeah.
And crucially, it lacked the power to actually enforce its own laws. It couldn't raise troops effectively, couldn't impose taxes. Can you imagine trying to run national security like that? You can't even pay for defense.
It sounds impossible. There was that quote, wasn't there? Someone writing as Brutus the Next.
Yeah, Brutus Next summed it up perfectly. He said the powers of Congress under the Articles amount to little more than that of recommending.
Just suggestion.
Basically. It was an idealized view, maybe, but it proved completely incapable of managing the country's security or even its internal unity. It just didn't work.
So the framers saw this failure. They had to fix it with the Constitution, but they still had that fear of tyranny. How did they square that circle?
Well, they designed the system we still have today, built around shared and separated powers. Marybeth P. Ulrich explains this structure is fundamental. National security policymaking requires cooperation and coordination. It can't just be one branch doing whatever it wants.
It's built for argument, almost. That famous line from Edwin Corwin.
Oh, yeah. An invitation to struggle for the privilege of directing American foreign policy.
And the key is that struggle isn't a bug, it's a feature. It's meant to be like that.
Exactly. And it forces us into what you could call a paradox of institutional competency. Congress is supposed to be slow.
Right, has to consider all these different views, debate things, stay accountable through elections.
All essential democratic functions. But when it comes to urgent national security stuff, that very design means it almost never moves quickly. Not compared to the executive branch, anyway, which can be decisive sometimes.
And that tension, that slow versus fast, deliberate versus decisive, is just baked into the system. A constant constraint on strategy.
A foundational constraint. Now, this political architecture, this stage, this is where actual policy gets made. And the U.S. Army War College Guide emphasizes that policy has to be founded on national interests.
Okay, but how do you go from this vague idea of what's good for America to a concrete plan?
Well, you use the concept of interests to translate that general feeling, the guide calls it a non-operational goal, into something more concrete, a prioritized agenda. It's an intellectual process trying to define and sort out what really matters to the nation out there in the world.
And the guide makes a really important point here. Defining the interest shouldn't be limited by what we think we can do right now.
That's crucial. You define the interest first, and that sets the parameters for what your objective should look like, even if achieving the full interest isn't possible immediately. It tells you what you're aiming for long term.
And they offer that useful framework, the 4 levels of intensity.
Right. Survival, vital, important, or peripheral. It's a way to prioritize, to figure out how much risk or resources you're willing to expend on any given issue.
But it's not like these interests just get cooked up in the Oval Office in isolation, right? There's a whole ecosystem influencing this.
Oh, absolutely. That foundation is constantly being shaped and pushed and pulled by this huge, complex network of actors. You've got the formal government players, Congress and the executive branch, sure, but then you have think tanks, the media, all sorts of interest groups, public opinion. It's messy.
Let's maybe zero in on some of those non-governmental players. Think tanks seem particularly important in this space.
They are critical because they operate outside the day-to-day bureaucracy. They have a certain freedom, they can challenge the conventional wisdom, produce deep research, and they often serve as a source of personnel when administrations change.
The historical impact is pretty amazing when you look at it. That example during World War II.
The Council on Foreign Relations, yeah, generated something like 682 memoranda for the State Department on war and post-war planning. Astonishing volume.
But that sheer volume, all that information, brings us to another key strategic challenge, doesn't it? What R. Keohane and Joseph Nye called the paradox of plenty.
Exactly. You've got this absolute flood of information reports, data, news, analyses coming from everywhere. The genuinely scarce resource isn't information anymore. It's attention.
A plenitude of information leads to a poverty of attention. That quote really sticks. So what's the practical implication for a policymaker trying to make sense of it all?
It means that power, in a way, shifts to those who can filter effectively, those who can separate the valuable signal from all the noise. Keohane and I specifically mentioned that brand names and the ability to bestow an international seal of approval will become more important.
So the reputation of the think tank, how credible or objective it seemed to be, that becomes a kind of currency itself.
It really does. But, and this is a big but, we have to be careful about impartiality, right?
Yeah, the sources warn about that. Many of these influential think tanks can lean towards certain ideological positions, often reflecting who works there and, importantly, who funds them.
That's the caution. James McGann, from the Foreign Policy Research Institute, he noted that while think tanks might claim to be nonpartisan, insiders usually know exactly where they sit on the ideological spectrum.
And that polarization can create echo chambers, can't it?
It absolutely can. And it might mean that the middle ground, the sort of ideological center where you often find compromise and consensus, ends up having less of a consistent voice in the policy debate. It can actually narrow the menu of options that decision makers seriously consider.
Okay, so that policy menu and how leaders choose from it is also shaped by their fundamental view of how the world works, which brings us to international relations theory.
Right. These theories are like different lenses for looking at the world. They help us tackle those big questions. How do we shape events to serve our interests? How are other countries likely to react to what we do?
And we're focusing on the big 3: realism, liberal institutionalism, and constructivism.
Exactly. Each one gives you a fundamentally different picture, and so suggests a different approach to strategy. Take realism first. It's almost entirely focused on the structure of the international system, basically, how power is distributed and how states operate within that system, things like balancing against stronger powers or trying to dominate.
And for realists, what goes on inside a state, its type of government, or even international law, that doesn't really matter much.
Largely irrelevant, yeah.
Yeah.
Because there's no world government, no global 911 to call, international law is hard to enforce. States, in the realist view, will act to protect their security and pursue power, regardless of whether they're democracies or dictatorships.
That sounds like Hans Morgenthau's view. Interest defined in terms of power.
That's Klaas Morgenthau. He boiled down state motivation to interest defined in terms of power, and he really emphasized prudence, practical wisdom as the key virtue in politics. He warned against letting morality or ideology lead you into, as he put it, moral excess and political folly. Focus on power realities.
Then there's neorealism, Kenneth Waltz. He took the focus on structure even further.
He did. Waltz saw the balance of power less as a choice and more as an almost automatic process, driven by the anarchic nature of the international system itself. Survival is the absolute core interest, he argued, so states will inevitably balance against any rising power that looks like a threat. The structure basically dictates the behavior.
Okay, so that's realism. Then you have liberal institutionalism, which starts from a very different place.
Completely different assumption. It draws more from philosophers like John Locke, who saw the state of nature not just as constant war, but as a state of liberty where cooperation was actually possible.
So for liberals, cooperation and order aren't just pipe dreams. They're achievable.
They're feasible, yes. And the key way to achieve them is through international institutions. Think the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, the European Union, bodies like that.
How do these institutions help?
Well, they make it easier to negotiate and cooperate. They lower the costs of diplomacy, basically. They rely on things like reciprocity, the idea that if I cooperate with you, you'll cooperate back, and crucially, information sharing. Sharing information reduces uncertainty about what other countries are planning or intending.
So it makes it harder to cheat or miscalculate.
Exactly. Now, liberal scholars are realistic. They know you can't eliminate cheating or free riding entirely. But the value of the institutions is they provide these regular forums for interaction, for resolving disputes without resorting to force. They make long-term cooperation seem more beneficial than grabbing short-term gains through aggression.
Okay, realism focuses on power and structure. Liberalism on cooperation and institutions. What about the third one? Constructivism.
Constructivism shifts the focus again, this time onto identity and interests. The core idea here is that things like national identity and national interests aren't fixed. They're not set in stone.
They're constructed, socially built.
Precisely. They are relational and socially constructed. How a state sees another state as a friend, a rival, a threat, isn't just based on relative power levels. It depends heavily on their past interactions, shared norms, shared understandings.
Can you give an example of that?
Well, think about Germany and Japan after World War II. Both adopted strongly anti-militarist policies and identities. Now, a realist could easily explain why that happened. Initially, they were defeated, occupied, had little power.
Makes sense.
But the realist view struggles a bit to explain why those anti-militarist identities persisted for so long, even after the Cold War ended, even after both countries became major economic powers again.
So the constructivist argument is that the identity itself took root.
Exactly. The identity of being a peace state became deeply embedded in their societies, in their institutions. It shows how a state's self-perception, its identity, continues to shape its definition of national interest long after the original conditions that created it have changed.
These theories aren't just academic exercises, are they? They feed directly into policy debates, like the whole idea of the democratic peace.
Absolutely. Deborah L. Hannigan writes about this. The core idea is simple. The U.S. is safer when more countries are democracies, because democracies, statistically, very rarely go to war with each other.
So it aligns American values promoting democracy with core national security interests.
It's a very appealing connection. But the theory isn't just wishful thinking about shared values. There are specific proposed mechanisms. Scholars like Charles Lipson, James Fearon, Kenneth Schultz, they argue democratic institutions themselves help prevent war.
How so?
Because democratic systems with their competing branches of government, opposition parties, free press, public debate, they make a state's intentions much more transparent.
Harder to bluff.
Much harder to bluff. If a democratic leader wants to make a threat, they have to sell it to the public, get buy-in from the legislature. It goes through this messy, open process. So if a threat does emerge from that process, it's more likely to be credible. It reduces the chance of miscalculation that can lead to war.
Okay, so these theories influence how we see the world. What about how the U.S. actually acts? The debate often comes down to unilateralism versus multilateralism.
Right. And the sources are careful to point out these are more like ways or approaches, not full-blown strategies in themselves.
What's the core argument for unilateralism?
Unilateralists, often drawing on those realist ideas, tend to see the post-Cold War world as pretty dangerous. They argue the U.S., with its overwhelming power, should use it decisively to protect its interests, without getting bogged down or constrained by allies or international organizations.
The idea being that acting alone shows resolve, enhances credibility.
That's the argument. You saw it from advocates for the 2003 Iraq War, for instance. The belief that seeking UN approval or waiting for reluctant allies would weaken the U.S. position and embolden adversaries.
And the counterargument, multilateralism, rooted more in liberalism.
Definitely. Multilateralists stress that today's biggest problems, think climate change, pandemics, global economic instability, terrorism, transnational crime, these are inherently global.
Things no single nation, not even the U.S., can solve alone.
Exactly. They require global cooperation, burden sharing, working through those international institutions. Sovereign states just aren't equipped to handle these transnational threats by themselves.
So the fundamental tension here for policymakers, for you listening, is really between speed and legitimacy, isn't it?
That sums it up pretty well. Unilateralism offers potential speed and freedom of action, but often comes at the cost of international legitimacy, allied support, and maybe long-term resentment.
Whereas multilateralism brings legitimacy, helps share the burden, but it often means compromising, moving slower, dealing with frustrating partners.
It's a constant balancing act, a strategic choice with significant trade-offs either way.
Okay, let's shift gears now from the theories in the political context to the military instrument itself. How is strategic direction actually given to the military? The Goldwater-Nichols Act seems foundational here.
Oh, absolutely pivotal. The 1986 Goldwater-Nichols Act. Before that, you had significant problems with inter-service rivalry. The Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, sometimes they didn't work well together.
Which could lead to real problems in actual operations,
Yeah.
right? Confusion, inefficiency.
Major problems. Failures, even. Goldwater-Nichols is often called the most significant defense legislation since the National Security Act of 1947 created the modern structure. Its goals were huge: strengthen civilian control, organize the Department of Defense better, and crucially improve the quality of military advice going up to the President and Secretary of Defense.
And it forced the services to cooperate more, made them more joint.
It did. And critically, it elevated the role of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The chairman became the single principal military advisor responsible for providing unified military advice.
And part of that responsibility includes issuing the National Military Strategy.
Yes, the unclassified National Military Strategy, which gives broad strategic direction to the armed forces. And looking at how that document has evolved over time tells you a lot about how threat perceptions have changed.
Let's look at a few key versions. The 1992 Strategy under General Colin Powell.
That was the first one they actually published openly, made unclassified. And it was shaped massively by two huge events: the collapse of the Soviet Union just before, and the success of the Broad Coalition in the first Gulf War against Iraq.
So a shift away from the single massive Soviet threat.
Definitely. It recognized that regional conflicts, weapons proliferation, things that had maybe been kept in check by the Cold War superpower rivalry could now flare up more easily. The focus shifted towards being able to handle multiple complex regional issues rather than just one big war in Europe.
Then jump forward to 1997. What changed?
The 1997 National Military Strategy built on that, but it got more specific about new kinds of threats. It explicitly mentioned asymmetric and wildcard threats.
Which, looking back now,
Yeah, chillingly, it conceptually described the kind of threat posed by groups like Al-Qaeda even before 9/11. While it still emphasized the military's role in shaping the international environment through engagement and presence,
it still held on to the core mission.
it was very clear. The number one job remained to fight and win our nation's wars. Shaping was important, but winning wars was paramount.
Okay, fast forward again, post 9/11, post-Iraq and Afghanistan engagements, the 2011 strategy under Admiral Michael Mullen.
Right. This one reflects the experience of those long wars and also the impact of the 2008 global financial crisis. It described the world as multinodal. Lots of different power centers, shifting alliances, constant tension.
And it included something really unprecedented for a military strategy document, didn't it?
It did. For the very first time, a national military strategy identified the nation's debt as a national security risk.
Wow, why?
It was a recognition that America's economic health, Its fiscal stability directly impacts its ability to fund the military, project power, and sustain operations abroad. Economic security and national security were explicitly linked.
But the biggest strategic shock, the real earthquake that reshaped everything, was September 11th, 2001.
Undeniably, the National Defense Strategy that came out in 2005 was a direct result of that shock. It fundamentally tried to reorient military thinking away from just traditional state-on-state warfare.
It overturned the thinking from just a few years earlier.
Yeah, it basically scrapped the worldview of the 2001 Quadrennial Defense Review, which came out shortly before 9/11. The 2005 strategy recognized that the nature of competition itself was changing. It was moving away from purely military contests towards what the strategy called irregular, catastrophic, disruptive, and hybrid forms of conflict. It kicked off this long, difficult process within the Department of Defense to adapt, to move away from its traditional comfort zone of fighting conventional wars and towards dealing with this much messier, more complex security environment.
But that adaptation wasn't immediate, was it? There were criticisms early on.
No, it was slow. Even though the 2001 Quadrennial Defense Review, published right after 9/11, said Homeland Defense was the top priority, critics like Andrew Krapinovich pointed out that actual transformation was pretty marginal at first.
What was his point?
He noted that the big money was still going into traditional programs like new fighter jets, while the focus on truly different capabilities needed for counterterrorism or stabilization was lagging. He basically accused the government of a failure of imagination, which was exactly what the 9/11 Commission warned about.
So the ideas change faster than the institutions and the budgets.
That's often the case. There's institutional inertia, people, organizations, budgets. They tend to keep doing what they know, but the role of the military domestically did get clarified somewhat.
Through Homeland Security Presidential Directive 5.
Right, HSPD 5. It formally tasked the Secretary of Defense with providing military support to civilian authorities during domestic incidents, things like natural disasters or terrorist attacks. We call this Defense Support to Civil Authorities, or DSCA.
And there's a key constraint there regarding command, right?
Absolutely critical. When military forces operate domestically under DSCA, they always remain under the command and control of the Secretary of Defense. This ensures civilian authority over the military is maintained, even in a crisis here at home. Military command doesn't shift to, say, a state governor or a FEMA director.
Okay, so strategy is set, the military is organized. How does it actually do things? That gets us into joint doctrine.
Exactly. And the foundational doctrine for planning and executing operations is Joint Publication 3.0, Operations. It defines operational art, which sounds fancy, but it's really the thinking process.
How commanders and their staffs figure things out.
Right. It's the cognitive approach they use to develop strategies, campaigns, operations, by linking together the ends, what you want to achieve, the ways, how you'll do it, the means, what resources you have, and assessing the risks. It's the intellectual glue.
And a big concept in modern operations is unified action. What's that about?
Unified action is about getting everyone working together towards the same goal, even if they're not all under the same commander. It's the effort to synchronize and coordinate military operations with all the other players involved. Like other U.S. government agencies, State Department, USAID, international organizations, UN, NATO, non-governmental organizations like Doctors Without Borders or the Red Cross, and allied military forces.
And you said unity of effort, not unity of command. That's an important distinction.
Crucial, because you can't command an NGO or even sometimes an allied force in the same way you command U.S. troops. They have different mandates, different rules, sometimes different objectives. Unified action is about achieving harmony and shared purpose without necessarily having a single chain of command over everyone.
And Joint Publication 3.0 warns that failing to achieve that can be really detrimental.
It can jeopardize the whole mission. If different actors are working at cross purposes or duplicating effort or just not communicating, it creates friction and inefficiency. Think about a humanitarian group needing neutrality clashing with a military need to secure an area that happens all the time.
How does current doctrine view the overall global environment? Is it peace or war?
Well, the current view, laid out in Joint Publication 3.0, is more nuanced than that simple binary. It uses the idea of the competition continuum.
Okay.
It frames the world not as flipping between peace and war, but as an environment of enduring competition. And this competition plays out through a constant mixture of cooperation, competition, and armed conflict.
So those things can happen at the same time.
Absolutely. And that's the strategic sophistication of it. It allows policymakers and commanders to understand you can be interacting with the same country or actor in different ways simultaneously.
Give me an example.
Okay, the U.S. might be cooperating closely with Nation X on counter-piracy patrols in one part of the world,
While at the same time.
while simultaneously competing fiercely with Nation X over trade issues, or maybe challenging their excessive maritime claims in another region. It's not all or nothing. It's a mix.
Within that competition space, sometimes the goal is coercion, right?
Yeah.
Trying to force an adversary to change their behavior.
Right. And Joint Publication 3 points out that coercion is really hard. Why? Because it usually requires the target to visibly back down, to overtly submit. That's politically costly for them.
So it's not just about inflicting pain.
Not just about that. Success depends on manipulating the anticipated costs for the adversary. It's about getting inside their head, making them believe the cost of continuing their action is higher than the cost of stopping. It's about their perception.
And information plays a role here.
A huge role, especially when adversaries do things that break rules or create victims, what the doctrine might call encroachments. These actions are vulnerable because you can use information strategically. Expose what they're doing, show the evidence, highlight the victims. This can delegitimize their narrative, build sympathy for those affected, and basically raise the political price they pay for their actions, both domestically and internationally.
When we're trying to understand that adversary, to get inside their head, what tools do we use? There's the operational code.
Yes, refined by Alexander L. George. Operational code analysis tries to map out a specific political leader's belief system. It looks at their fundamental philosophical beliefs about the world and their instrumental beliefs about the best way to achieve goals. It's very leader-focused.
How does that differ from strategic culture?
Strategic culture, associated more with Jack L. Snyder, is broader. It's not about one leader. It's about the shared beliefs, attitudes, and patterns of behavior related to using force that exist across a whole society or within its strategic community. It's learned, passed down.
So operational code is the individual leader. Strategic culture is the whole group or nation.
That's a good way to think about the difference in scale. A leader's operational code might shift with experience, but strategic culture is deeper, more like a national habit of thought, often resistant to change.
And Snyder's warning was?
He strongly cautioned U.S. policymakers against assuming adversaries think just like us. Don't project American notions of strategic rationality onto others. You have to understand their culture's way of thinking about strategy, risk, and success. It might be very different.
Okay, we've covered politics, theory, strategy, execution. What about the limits? The ethical constraints. The just war tradition comes in here.
Absolutely essential. Martin L. Cook argues that understanding and applying just war principles is a core competency for any strategic leader. The U.S. is bound to it by treaties, by policy, and by a sense of moral commitment. You can't lead strategy without grappling with it.
And it breaks down into parts, right? Starting with jus ad bellum.
Right. Just ad bellum, justice of going to war. These are the criteria you have to meet before resorting to force. Things like having a just cause.
Like self-defense.
Self-defense against aggression received is the baseline standard in modern thinking, yes. You also need right intention, legitimate authority to declare war, a reasonable chance of success, proportionality of ends, and war must be a last resort. It sets a very high bar.
Then, once the conflict starts, there's jus in bello.
Justice in war, how you conduct yourself during the conflict. The two main principles here are discrimination and proportionality.
Discrimination means?
Targeting only legitimate military objectives.
Yeah.
You must distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, between military targets and civilian objects, and intentionally attacking civilians is prohibited.
And proportionality in this context.
Proportionality here means the harm caused by a specific military attack must not be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage expected from that attack.
So you can't destroy a whole village just to get one enemy soldier hiding there.
Exactly. That would clearly violate proportionality. The anticipated civilian harm would be way out of whack with the military gain.
And finally, the third part, which seems maybe the hardest.
Yeah.
Jus post bellum.
Justice after war. This is the huge challenge of turning battlefield success into a lasting, just, and stable peace. Eric Patt suggests a morally satisfying peace needs 3 key milestones.
What are they?
First, you need order. Establishing basic security, governance, rule of law. That has to come first.
Then?
Second, building enduring justice. This involves things like accountability for past wrongs, maybe war crimes tribunals, reconciliation processes.
And the third milestone.
Conciliation. This is the long-term goal of former enemies coming to terms with the past and finding a way to live together as partners in a future peace. But Pat stresses you can't really get to justice and conciliation without establishing order first, which often requires military involvement initially.
And this is incredibly relevant for situations like Afghanistan or Iraq, right, where the post-combat phase is so crucial.
Absolutely. Joint Publication 3.0 itself talks about how success in stabilization operations often requires the military to perform limited local governance tasks temporarily until legitimate local civilian institutions can take over. It's the ultimate strategic test, managing that transition from fighting to building a sustainable peace.
Wow. Okay, that was a huge amount of ground we covered.
It really was. But what I think this deep dive shows is how American strategy is this incredibly complex mix. You've got those founding political ideas, that fear of central power, the built-in struggle between branches constantly bumping up against global realities, and these different ways of seeing the world through theory.
And all of that forces the military to operate across that very nuanced competition continuum while trying to stay within these strict doctrinal rules and ethical boundaries. The big takeaway for you, listening, has to be that strategy is never finished, right? It's always moving, always adapting to new threats, new tech, political winds.
Constantly dynamic. And the national security professional, as the U.S. Army War College Guide points out, has to stay aware of all the players. Government, NGOs, think tanks, media. You have to choose your sources carefully, be aware of that potential bias and polarization we talked about, especially with think tanks.
Knowing who's saying what and maybe why they're saying it becomes a critical skill for navigating that paradox of plenty.
Essential. Okay, so as you pull all this together, the foundations, the theories, the strategy documents, the execution, the ethics, here's a final thought to chew on.
Lay it on us.
The international system we have today with the UN, international law, all these institutions, it's largely an order the U.S. helped create after World War II, based on sharing power when it was dominant. Now you see rising tension between that idea of international cooperation and states aggressively pursuing their own national interests. Think about China, or resurgent Russia.
So the question is,
How durable is that U.S.-created order? And looking ahead, which of those international relations theories we discussed, realism, liberalism, constructivism, which lens, or maybe which combination of lenses, will be most vital for navigating the challenges and maintaining stability in the decades to come? Does the U.S. need to pick one or become truly adept at using insights from all three?